my number one biggest piece of advice for anyone who goes into the hospital, when you are a patient going into the hospital, my number one biggest piece of advice is do not be afraid to ask questions. And do not be afraid to ask questions until your question is answered. And my number one biggest piece of advice is do not be afraid to ask questions. And here's why. There has been, for someone who has always been in and out of the hospital, is you start to pick up on what's normal within the hospital setting. You know, for example, if you were into the hospital, you can't expect to have IV fluids, more so in the very beginning because you might be dehydrated. And you start to pick up on certain things within the hospital setting as to what's normal and what's not. And for me, in this one particular event, this was a while back, is a nurse wanted to give me a form of medication that was new to me. I was very unfamiliar with this medication. It was new. So I had asked the nurse, and I was like, excuse me, I was like, what is that medication? Because the nurse wanted to give me this particular medication. And I had asked the nurse, what is this medication? And she was like, and she told me the name of it. I cannot remember the name of it. And I was like, what is the medication for? And she was like, oh, it's because you're diabetic. And I was like, I am not diabetic. And she was like, really? And then so they look on the computer, and they said, well, it's on your chart. And I was like, I'm not diabetic. So long story short is I declined the medication. They were like, I am so sorry. And they were like, I apologize. And when you're in the hospitals, do not be afraid to ask questions, because let's just say that if I didn't ask questions, and let's just say if I happen to take the medication, is while I'm in the hospital setting, if I'm just taking this medication, it could hold the potential to have severe negative effects with my health later down the road, because I am being treated for something that I do not have, that I do not need, you know? And so do not be afraid to ask questions anytime you're in the hospital. And I wanted to mention this as well, is that earlier this year, which I would call fairly recent, when I was admitted into the hospital for having a pneumonia, is a nurse, I was just about to call it a night, and I was about to go to sleep. And I'm laying down, and the nurse happens to walk in, and I just feel someone doing something with my hospital bed. So of course I open up my eyes, and I ask, may I ask what it is you're doing? Well, my nurse was putting soft pads around my hospital bed frame, or my hospital bed, and I had asked, may I ask what it is you're doing? And they said, it was along the lines of, it is our policy that we have to put these pads, that way if you have a seizure, that, you know, you're not going to hurt yourself, you know? And I was like, and I was kind of about it, and it just threw me off guard with this experience. And I had asked the nurse, and I was like, can you repeat that? You know, it caught me off guard. So now I'm awake. And they had repeat what they said, and I was like, I don't have seizures. And then she was like, really? And I was like, yeah. And so she was like, it's on your chart. She was like, you never had a seizures, not once in your lifetime. And I was like, no, I haven't had not one. I haven't had a seizure at all, like not even once. You know. They were like, it's on your chart. They were like, I'm so sorry. I apologize. Now, the reason why I brought this particular experience up as well is because although it is not a medication, right? It is on my chart that I have seizures. Now, I'm not familiar with having seizures, so I don't know if it is treatable in any way. However, the reason why I brought this particular experience up is because let's just say if I didn't correct saying I do not have these episodes, or I do not have seizures, right? Let's just say if I happen to be asleep and they happen to give me medication, again, I don't know if seizures is treatable, let's just say if I was asleep and they gave me this medication, I did not correct in the very beginning that I do not have seizures. So the purpose as to why, again, I explain that is because when you are in the hospital, do not be afraid to ask questions, because sometimes accidents do happen, mistakes do happen, unfortunately, and if you see something that is abnormal, or if you see something like, again, what is that medication? And they tell you. There might be some word you cannot interpret or pronounce your own, you know. Do not be afraid to ask, what is it for? Because when you can ask that question, what is this medication mainly treated for, primarily treated for, then you can get an idea, oh, okay, well, I do have this condition, that's probably the medication my doctor gave me, you know. And do not be afraid to ask your doctor what the medication is and what it's treated for. So that way when your nurse starts to give you these medications, you already are familiar with, you already know what to expect, you know what I mean? When you're in the hospital, do not be afraid to ask questions. In this context of the video, it was primarily medications. But if there's something that a nurse, a doctor, anyone in a medical setting is doing that you question or may wonder why are they doing it or why something is being given, do not be afraid to ask. May ask what it is. May ask what is it. May ask what is this medication primarily treated for. You know, do not be afraid to ask questions like that. And especially when it comes to you, the patient, you know what I mean? You should always be aware. Because although, yes, you may be in hospital, again, accidents do happen, unfortunately. And it's just good to ask questions. If you have a question, do not be afraid to ask questions until your question is able to be answered. Anyhow, I hope this video was able to bring some form of value to and for you. And I want to, before I end this video, I want to give a huge shout out to all of the healthcare professionals, because they too are people and they too go through a lot. And I want to give a huge shout out. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue twisted. I want to give a huge shout out to healthcare professionals, because they too are people. They too are working tirelessly behind the scenes to help you make it back home. I want to give a huge shout out to nurses, doctors, surgeons, janitors, the cafeteria people that make sure that cooks your food, that make sure you get fed. Everyone within the healthcare community, especially the respiratory therapists, more so in my case. I am around them quite a lot. Shout out to all of you guys. I love you, appreciate you. And remember, grow through what you go through. Much love.
In this world, we all have our struggles. Spinal muscular atrophy is a test of our muscles.